Hi, I'm Joe Finsternis, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about the 5 most underrated sequels in my opinion. Now, this idea was kind of stolen from another YouTube channel. I was checking out my subscriptions earlier when I saw that Watchmojo had just done a video on the top 10 most underrated sequels, and it got me thinking about the film sequels out there, which I personally find to be just as good, if not better, than their predecessors, but that a lot of people seem to hate on. In some cases, a couple of these movies are just ignored by the general public. You know, they never really made any big waves when they came out. And, the main thing that made me select these 5 films was Rotten Tomatoes. And I stated in a previous video that I've stopped trusting that site, and that statement stands true. But there are so many sequels out there that people just nitpick to death and that critics will bash on, mainly because their predecessors were such hard acts to follow. But the films that I've selected here are ones which have rotten ratings from both critics and audiences alike. As for the order that they're in, it's not necessarily based on their percentages. I wasn't really paying that much attention to the numbers. I just looked for the green splat logo. It's really based on just how underrated I personally find them to be. Anyway, without further ado, number 5 is Kick-Ass 2. Now, I really enjoyed the first Kick-Ass movie, although I have to admit it kind of underwhelmed me. I can't talk. It kind of underwhelmed me the first time I watched it. The worst thing that you can do with a movie is to go in expecting it to be a certain way. And the problem with that was I was expecting it to be more silly and over the top and gory than it turned out to be, and it had been hyped up quite a bit. So when I finally watched it, I don't know, it just wasn't what I was hoping for it to be. I've watched it 2 more times since then, though, and it's definitely gotten better with age. As for Kick-Ass 2, when I went and saw this movie, it was everything that I had hoped the first movie would be. It was sillier, it was more over the top, and it was more gory. I thought that the action scenes were done much better. There's this one bit involving Jim Carrey and a group of heroes that he's gathered that's just awesome. And I liked that they brought some new villains to the picture, especially Mother Russia, who just about steals the show. It was kind of weak that they pushed the other side villains, to the background. They didn't really get to do as much. Another thing that I really appreciated about this movie was that it got a lot darker than the first one. There was one point where I had tears welling up in my eyes, and I know that might make me sound like a huge baby, but that's not going to be the last time it happens in this video. And that brings me to number 4, which is The Eye 2. Now, the first Eye movie is one of the creepiest films I've seen. And for another thing, it just had a very creative premise going for it. The idea that this girl who's been blind receives these donated eyes from someone who is able to see the dead, and now she can see things that other people aren't supposed to see, and it's freaking her out. And, the scares in that movie were just so well executed. If I was to make a top 10 list of my picks for the scariest movies, it would definitely be on there. But The Eye 2 would be ahead of it by just 1 point. I thought that the Pang brothers really outdid themselves this time. The premise for this character's psychic abilities is completely different. In fact, one of the main complaints of this movie is that it has nothing to do with the first film. One guy even said that it has nothing to do with eyes, although I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that the main theme here is that, these characters are gifted with a second sight, and their eyes can see things that other people can't. There was even a point in this movie, which this is another part where I'm going to sound like a huge baby, but there was a point where this movie had me, so on the edge of my seat and was filling me with so much dread that I didn't want anything to happen because I was scared to see what was going to, pop out. And the big scare that happened during that particular scene genuinely freaked me out. So, that's pretty much all I've got to say about the I-2 and what I loved about it. On to number 3, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. I've actually seen this listed by a few people as one of the worst movie sequels, and I can't understand why. I guess I haven't really read any reviews on it, to be honest, but I'm guessing one of the main reasons is that the first film is known to be one of the scariest movies ever made, and the second film is just silly. But that was Tobe Hooper's goal with making this movie. He was intending to make it more of a satire this time around, and I think it worked. I thought it was a genuinely funny picture. I also thought that the special effects in the movie were amazing. There's not a very high body count here, but the kill scenes are more elaborate. There was one makeup effect in particular on this character called Chop Top, who's got this metal plate in his head, and there's a point where you can see it through the skin, and I thought that looked, once again, amazing. Plus, the cast in this movie is pretty solid. You've got Bill Moseley playing the Chop Top character that I just mentioned. This was kind of where he started out as a horror icon. Since then, he's gone on to be in, like, House of a Thousand Corpses, The Devil's Rejects, Repo the Genetic Opera, the 2001 Maniac sequel. He's been in quite a few horror movies lately. Also, it's got Dennis Hopper in it, playing a crazy person. This time he's a crazy sheriff. There's really nothing about this movie that doesn't appeal to me, and that's pretty much all I've got to say for it. Moving on. Number 2 is Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Now, to sort of address Halloween 3, I don't think the main problem with it was the fact that it didn't have Michael Myers in it. I think the real problem was that they had originally intended to make an anthology series, and then went on to make the second movie another one about Michael Myers. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the second movie as well, but once again, if you're supposed to make an anthology movie, don't make the second one about the same fucking thing, because audiences are going to expect the sequels after that to be about the same thing again. But, when they went back to Michael Myers and they made Halloween 4, they were pretty much trying to satisfy their audiences, but I think that they succeeded in more than just creating a crowd pleaser. I thought that they made a genuinely scary movie that stands shoulder to shoulder with the first film, in my opinion. The stakes are much higher in this one, whereas in the original, Myers was going after this grown woman. I'm sorry, but I can't believe that Jamie Lee Curtis was a teenager at the time that they made it. In this one, he's going after his niece, who's just a little girl in this film, and so the stakes are much higher in that respect. But the thing that makes this movie stand out among the rest is the ending of the film. The first time I watched this was way back when I was a teenager, and those final moments before the credits had me up for most of the night. And I didn't watch it again until just a little over a year ago because, that was when I got the DVD. And it didn't make me stay up, most of the night that time around. But, in fact, that really hasn't happened since I was a teenager. But it still freaked me out quite a bit. It was another one of those moments where Tears were welling up in my eyes. I could feel the goosebumps rising up on my arms. So, yeah, Halloween 4. My favorite part was when it ended. Anyway, number 1 for me is not only the most underrated sequel, but I also firmly believe... I'm having trouble talking, guys. I also firmly believe this to be the most underrated comedy, period, of all time. Number 1 is Return of the Killer Tomatoes. Now, when people hear a title like that, or particularly for the first film, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, you know, their knee-jerk reaction is, you gotta be fucking kidding me. And I agree, it's a stupid premise, but for those of you who don't know anything about the first movie other than its title alone, it's a fucking comedy. First off, there are musical numbers in this movie. Second, the tomatoes themselves don't have teeth or anything that looks even remotely threatening. They're just ordinary tomatoes that roll around and make silly noises, and somehow they kill people. You don't really see the process of how they get this accomplished. Mostly the killing scenes just comprised of people being hit by jumping tomatoes. And then to top it off, when critics saw early screenings of the film and the reviews started coming out, the filmmakers took a quote from one of these critics who was bashing the movie, and they stuck it up on the poster. Their target audience was people who were going to have a sense of humor about it and were expecting a stupid movie that they could laugh at. And that's pretty much what they got. So, in Return of the Killer Tomatoes, I think that they did a much better job with the comedy. For one thing, it's got a young George Clooney in it bringing the funny. He shows a lot of charisma, even back in the day. Shit, I'm starting to have a brain fart here. Oh yeah, one of the main problems with the first movie was that, you know, other than the tomatoes, it didn't really have a solid villain throughout the picture. But this movie does introduce you to one in the form of a genetic scientist who is taking tomatoes and he's using this ray gun to turn them into people. So the premise is more absurd this time around. You know, he's planning to take his tomato people army and rule the world with them. It also makes fun of merchandising near the end of the film. But easily my favorite gag in the film is when they bring up the topic of product placement. Like, they literally broach the subject in the movie, and then after that point it just becomes a running gag and they go way overboard with it, and it never stops being funny. So, in the end, if you have a sense of humor, I highly recommend giving this movie a chance. So, I'm not a big question guy. You know, a lot of people like to ask questions at the end of their reviews, but the only reason I don't do that is because I'm afraid that after posting so many videos, it's going to get a little too monotonous. But in the case of this one, if there are any, you know, sequels out there which you thought were criminally neglected or looked over, let me know what they are down in the comments. Anyway, I hope y'all have a good one.